The small town of Pine Ridge sat nestled between towering mountains and thick forests. Most folks there lived by an unspoken rule: keep your distance from wildlife, especially wolves. But Ranger Kate Turner had always been different. From her childhood days spent exploring the woods behind her grandparents' cabin to her 15 years as a wildlife ranger, Kate had always felt more at home among the trees and animals than in crowded rooms with people. Her colleagues at the ranger station often joked that she could speak to animals, a comment she'd brush off with a laugh, though deep down she knew there was some truth to it. She had a way of understanding creatures that others feared. It was during a brutal winter 3 years ago when Kate first encountered the wolf who would change her life. The temperatures had plummeted well below freezing for weeks, making her patrols especially difficult. She'd been tracking reports of illegal traps set up in protected areas, a frustrating battle she fought every winter against poachers looking to make quick money from wolf pelts. That January morning had started like any other. Kate had loaded her truck with supplies, thermos filled with hot coffee, and headed out at dawn. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, making tracking easier. About 4 miles into the eastern forest, she noticed unusual marks in the snow, signs of struggle rather than the clean tracks of an animal moving freely. Following the disturbed snow pattern, Kate came upon a sight that made her stomach turn. A large gray wolf lay on its side, one paw caught in a cruel metal trap. Blood stained the snow around it. Most wolves would have gnawed through their own limb to escape such a trap. But something was different about this one. He was young, probably just reaching maturity, and seemed too exhausted to fight anymore. When Kate approached, the wolf lifted his head weakly, amber eyes meeting hers. There was no growl, no bared teeth, just a quiet resignation that broke her heart. "Hey there, big guy," she whispered, keeping her voice low and calm. "That looks pretty bad, doesn't it?" The wolf watched her, panting slightly as she slowly reached for her tranquilizer gun. Protocol was clear: sedate the animal, remove the trap, treat any immediate wounds, and transport it to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center 3 hours away. But something about this wolf made Kate hesitate. The rehab center was overwhelmed this season, and an adult wolf would likely be kept sedated until spring before release, if he survived at all. Making a decision that could cost her job, Kate tranquilized the wolf, carefully removed the trap, and loaded him into her truck. Instead of driving to the rehab center, she took him to her own cabin on the outskirts of town. For 3 weeks, Kate nursed the wolf she began calling Shadow, a name that came to her the first night as she watched his silhouette against the cabin wall, cast by firelight. The trap had done serious damage, cutting deep into muscle and nearly hitting bone. Each day she cleaned the wound, applied medicine, and changed the bandages while he was sedated. She kept detailed notes of his recovery, telling herself this was a scientific endeavor, not the emotional connection it was rapidly becoming. By the 4th week, Shadow was able to put weight on his healing paw. Kate knew it was time to release him, though the thought filled her with an unexpected sadness. She'd become accustomed to his presence, the way his ears perked up when she entered the room, how he watched her move around the cabin with curious eyes. One crisp February morning, Kate drove Shadow deep into the forest, far from trapping areas but within known wolf territory. When she opened the cage in her truck bed, the wolf stepped out cautiously, testing his healed paw on the snow. He turned to look at her one last time, those amber eyes seeming to hold something like recognition, before loping off into the trees. Kate was certain she would never see Shadow again. Wolves were wild creatures with strong instincts to rejoin their packs or establish their own territories. But life in Pine Ridge had a way of surprising even those who knew its rhythms best. 2 weeks after the release, Kate was chopping wood behind her cabin when she felt eyes on her. Looking up toward the tree line, she caught a glimpse of gray fur and a familiar silhouette. Shadow stood watching from a distance, perfectly still except for the soft cloud of his breath in the cold air. "Well, look who it is," Kate said softly, setting down her axe. She didn't approach, understanding the new boundaries between them. Shadow was wild again, as he should be, but something had drawn him back to her. This began a strange relationship unlike anything Kate had experienced in her years working with wildlife. Shadow never came close enough to touch. He maintained a careful distance, sometimes 50 yards, Sometimes more, but he returned to her property every few days, then every few weeks, then with surprising regularity. The locals soon began reporting sightings of a lone wolf near the ranger's cabin. Some were concerned, but Kate assured them Shadow posed no threat. "He's just checking in," she would say with a shrug, though privately she marveled at the connection that had somehow formed between them. By the end of the first year, Shadow had established what seemed to be a territory that conveniently overlapped with the areas Kate patrolled. She would sometimes find evidence that he had followed her routes after she'd passed through, paw prints overlapping her boot tracks, or signs that he had rested in spots where she had taken her lunch breaks. Fellow rangers noticed the pattern too. Her boss, Ranger Tom, pulled her aside one day with concern etched on his weathered face. "You know wolves aren't pets, right, Kate? Whatever you did for this one, it's created something unnatural. Might be dangerous for both of you." Kate nodded respectfully but knew better. What existed between her and Shadow wasn't ownership or dependence. It was something like mutual respect, a recognition between two beings who had helped each other in some fundamental way. During her patrols, Kate began leaving small offerings at certain spots, scraps of meat or fish left on rocks where Shadow could find them. In return, she sometimes discovered unusual gifts. A particularly beautiful feather placed conspicuously on a fallen log, or a small pile of interesting stones arranged in a way that seemed deliberate. Whether these were actually gifts or just her imagination, Kate couldn't say for certain, but she collected each one, keeping them in a wooden box on her mantelpiece. By the third year, Shadow had become something of a local legend. Hikers reported glimpses of a large gray wolf that seemed to watch over the trails, appearing when people ventured too close to dangerous areas or when storms were approaching. Children made up stories about the guardian wolf, and tourists hoped for a sighting during their visits. Kate never confirmed or denied these stories. The truth of her connection with Shadow was private, something precious she kept close to her heart. On her days off, she would sometimes sit on her porch with a book, looking up occasionally to see Shadow at the edge of the clearing, keeping his distance but undeniably present. One evening, as summer faded into autumn, Kate sat watching the sunset from her favorite spot on a ridge overlooking the valley. The golden light bathed the mountains in warm hues, and the first stars were appearing in the darkening eastern sky. A soft rustle behind her revealed Shadow closer than he usually came, settling into the grass about 20 feet away. "Beautiful evening, isn't it?" Kate said, not turning to look directly at him, respecting the space he needed. "Sometimes I think you appreciate these views even more than I do." As darkness fell and the stars multiplied overhead, Kate felt a profound contentment. Their unusual friendship defied explanation, crossing boundaries between wild and tame, human and animal. It wasn't something she could easily describe to others, but sitting there with Shadow nearby, she knew it was real and valuable. Neither of them could have known that their peaceful coexistence would soon be tested in ways they couldn't imagine. Neither could have guessed that the bond formed between a wounded wolf and his human savior would eventually lead to events that would astonish an entire community. But for now, in the quiet of that autumn evening, all was well in their shared world between wilderness and civilization, a delicate balance maintained by mutual trust and the simple understanding that sometimes the most important connections cross the boundaries we think define us. Winter came early to Pine Ridge that year. By mid-October, the mountains were already capped with snow, and the forests were painted in shades of gold and crimson. Ranger Kate welcomed the changing season, even as her fellow rangers complained about the plummeting temperatures. She had always loved winter, the quiet stillness of the forest, the way snow cushioned sound, creating a peaceful blanket over the wilderness she protected. For the past 3 years, winter had also meant more frequent visits from Shadow. The large gray wolf seemed to understand the challenges the cold season brought, appearing more regularly near her cabin as if checking that she had enough firewood stacked or that smoke continued to rise from her chimney. The Weather Service says this might be the harshest winter in decades, Tom warned during their weekly staff meeting at the ranger station. "We need to be extra careful on patrols, especially in the high country. No lone rangers in the backcountry when storms are expected." Kate nodded along with the others, though privately she knew she'd never truly be alone in the woods. Shadow had become her unofficial patrol partner, often tracking parallel to her routes, visible just enough for her to catch glimpses of his gray coat moving through the trees. 2 days after the meeting, the first major storm hit. It started as light flurries in the morning but quickly intensified. By noon, visibility had dropped to mere feet and the wind howled through the mountain passes with frightening force. Kate had been checking on a research station in the eastern section of the park when the storm worsened. Heading back now, she radioed to headquarters. Should be there in about an hour. Be careful, came the crackling response. Roads are getting bad fast. The drive that should have taken 45 minutes stretched well beyond an hour as Kate navigated her truck through increasingly treacherous conditions. Snow accumulated faster than her wipers could clear it, and the road all but disappeared beneath a growing white blanket. She leaned forward in her seat, straining to see through the swirling white, her knuckles pale against the steering wheel. Just 5 miles from the ranger station, on a section of road that hugged the mountainside, Kate felt a sudden shift in her truck's traction. The back end began to slide toward the edge, where a steep drop-off waited beyond the guardrail. She turned into the skid as she'd been taught, but black ice beneath the snow gave her no purchase. For a brief moment, time seemed to slow. Kate saw her headlights illuminate swirling snow, felt the sickening sensation of falling as the truck broke through the guardrail, and heard the terrible scraping of metal against rock. Her last clear thought was of Shadow, wondering if he was safely sheltered from the storm. The accident made front-page news in the small town. Local ranger lost in tragic accident, read the headline. Search and rescue teams battled the continuing storm for nearly 8 hours before they could reach the wreckage at the bottom of the ravine. By then it was too late. News traveled quickly through Pine Ridge. At the diner, the hardware store, and the post office, conversations turned somber as people shared stories about the kind-hearted ranger who had protected their wilderness and wildlife with such dedication. She knew those mountains better than anyone, said the elderly owner of the general store, shaking his head sadly. Just goes to show nature doesn't play favorites. At the ranger station, a makeshift memorial appeared. Colleagues left pine branches, handwritten notes, and photographs of Kate smiling on mountain summits or kneeling beside wildlife tracks, teaching children about the forest she loved. While the human community mourned in their way, something unusual was happening in the wilderness. Regular hikers reported no sightings of the now famous lone wolf in the days following the accident. It was as if Shadow had vanished along with Kate. Maybe he knew somehow, whispered a local teacher to her husband over dinner. Animals sense things we don't. The truth was stranger than they imagined. 3 days after the accident, Tom had gone to Kate's cabin to collect her personal effects. As he approached the small clearing where the cabin stood, he stopped short. There, sitting motionless in the yard, was Shadow. The wolf's posture was different than Tom had ever observed in his 30 years of wildlife work. Rather than the alert, ready stance of a predator, Shadow sat with his head lowered, almost like a domestic dog in mourning. Well, I'll be, Tom murmured, keeping his distance. He'd known about Kate's unusual relationship with the wolf, but had never witnessed it firsthand. You're waiting for her, aren't you? The wolf raised his head slightly at the sound of the human voice, but made no move to flee. His amber eyes seemed to search beyond Tom, looking for someone who would never return. Tom took the unusual encounter as a sign. Instead of boxing up Kate's belongings that day, he simply collected the essential paperwork and left the cabin as it was. Something told him the wolf needed time. Kate's funeral was held 5 days after the accident, once the storm had finally passed. The small community church couldn't contain all who came to pay their respects. People spilled out onto the snow-covered lawn, standing in respectful silence as the simple wooden coffin was carried out to be transported to the cemetery on the edge of town. The procession wound through Pine Ridge's main street. Shops closed for the hour, and residents stood on sidewalks with heads bowed as the hearse passed, followed by dozens of cars and trucks. By the time they reached the cemetery, the weak winter sun had emerged from behind the clouds, casting long shadows across the pristine snow. As the mourners gathered around the gravesite, the town's elderly minister spoke of Kate's love for the wilderness and her gentle spirit. Former colleagues shared brief stories of her dedication and quiet humor. Then, as the coffin was being lowered into the ground, a movement at the edge of the forest caught everyone's attention. Standing just beyond the cemetery's stone wall was a large gray wolf. Shadow's coat stood out starkly against the white snow as he watched the proceedings with an unnerving stillness. Several people gasped. A few reached for children instinctively, pulling them closer, but Tom raised his hand in a calming gesture. "It's all right," he said, his voice carrying in the winter air. "That's Shadow. Kate saved him years ago." He paused, looking at the wolf with newfound respect. Somehow he knew to come. The funeral continued, though many eyes darted nervously to the wolf that remained at the forest's edge, observing with what could only be described as solemn attention. When the last words were spoken and handfuls of earth were scattered on the coffin, the mourners began to disperse, casting final glances toward the unusual spectator. "Should we do something about the wolf?" asked the minister, concerned for the remaining elderly visitors. Tom shook his head. "No, Kate would want him left alone. He's not threatening anyone." As predicted, Shadow made no move to approach the humans. He remained at his post, watching until the last car had left the cemetery. Only the caretaker, staying behind to finish his work, witnessed what happened next. The wolf moved forward cautiously, crossing into the cemetery grounds with deliberate steps. He approached the fresh grave, now covered with flowers and small mementos, and circled it once before settling into the snow beside it. There he stayed as afternoon faded into evening. Word of Shadow's vigil spread through town by nightfall. Some found it eerie, others touching. A few skeptics suggested the wolf was simply confused or had been drawn by the scent of so many humans in one place. But those who had known Kate best understood that something remarkable was happening. The next morning, the caretaker arrived to find Shadow still there, lying beside the grave as if standing guard. He called Tom, unsure what to do. "Has he threatened you?" Tom asked. "No, sir. Hasn't moved except to lift his head when I approached. Just watching me, that's all. Then leave him be." For 3 days, Shadow remained. People began bringing offerings. Meat left at a respectful distance, bowls of water placed near the cemetery entrance. The wolf accepted these gifts only after dark, when no humans were present. Photographers from the local paper tried to capture images of the mourning wolf, but Shadow would retreat to the forest edge whenever anyone approached too closely. It seemed he wanted his grief, if that's what it was, to remain private, much like the relationship he had shared with Kate. On the 4th day after the funeral, heavy snow began to fall again. Tom drove to the cemetery, concerned about the wolf's welfare, only to find Shadow gone. Fresh tracks led back into the forest, a final journey away from the human world that had briefly intersected with his. Or so everyone thought. No one could have predicted what would happen next, or how Shadow's story would take a turn that would leave the entire community of Pine Ridge questioning everything. They thought they knew about the bonds between humans and wild creatures. 2 weeks after the funeral, life in Pine Ridge was trying to return to normal. The ranger station had reassigned Kate's duties, her desk now occupied by a transfer from a neighboring district. Fresh snow had covered her grave and visitors to the cemetery dwindled. But normal wasn't a word that could describe what was happening at the edge of town. Shadow had not truly left. After disappearing from the cemetery during the snowstorm, the wolf had established a new pattern that both puzzled and fascinated the townsfolk. Each evening, as dusk settled over the mountains, he would emerge from the forest and make his way to Kate's grave. There he would remain until dawn, a silent sentinel keeping watch through the long winter nights. The cemetery caretaker, an older man named Henry who had tended the grounds for over 30 years, was the first to notice this routine. At first, he worried about the wolf's presence, concerned it might frighten visitors. But Shadow made no threatening moves, keeping a respectful distance from any humans who came to visit other graves. "Never seen anything like it," Henry told his wife over breakfast one morning. "That animal's grieving, plain as day. Walks the same path every night, circles the grave 3 times, then just lies there until morning light." Word spread quickly, and soon people began making special trips to witness the phenomenon for themselves. Some came out of curiosity, others out of skepticism, but most left with a sense of wonder. Parents brought children to observe from a distance, using the opportunity to teach them about the complex emotional lives of animals. Tom, Kate's former boss, made weekly visits, often bringing food that he would leave near the cemetery entrance. On one such evening, he stayed later than usual, sitting on a bench some distance from Kate's grave. Shadow arrived at his customary time, seeming to acknowledge Tom's presence with a brief glance before taking up his position. "I never believed her, you know," Tom said quietly, speaking more to himself than to the wolf. "When Kate talked about you, how special you were, I thought she was just being sentimental." He watched as Shadow settled into the snow. "Guess I owed her an apology." As January deepened into February, the coldest part of winter gripped the mountains. Temperatures plummeted to record lows, and heavy snowfall isolated the town for days at a time. Concerned citizens wondered if Shadow would abandon his vigil, seeking shelter during the worst of the weather. Henry, who checked the cemetery regardless of conditions, reported that the wolf remained faithful, though he sometimes sought the minimal shelter offered by a nearby spruce tree during the heaviest snowfalls. During one particularly brutal storm, Henry defied regulations and built a small lean-to near Kate's grave. "Don't tell anyone," he confided to Tom. "I know we're not supposed to interfere with wildlife, but it didn't seem right, him sitting out there in that blizzard." To everyone's surprise, Shadow used the shelter, though he positioned himself so he could still see the grave. This small act of acceptance seemed to cement a tentative trust between the wolf and certain members of the community. By March, Shadow's vigil had attracted attention beyond Pine Ridge. A wildlife photographer passing through captured images of the wolf beside the snow-covered grave, and the story was picked up by regional news. Soon, wildlife researchers and animal behaviorists began arriving, hoping to observe this unprecedented relationship between a wild predator and human community. Dr. Lisa Chen, a respected wildlife biologist from the State University, set up a research blind at a discreet distance from the cemetery. After a week of observation, she requested a meeting with town officials and interested residents. "What we're witnessing is extraordinarily rare," she explained to the packed town hall. "Wolves are highly social and emotionally complex animals, but this level of apparent grief directed toward a human is virtually undocumented." A local hunter raised his hand. "How do we know it's grief? Maybe it's just confusion or habit." Dr. Chen nodded, acknowledging the question. "That's an excellent point. We can't know exactly what Shadow is experiencing, but his behavior shows patterns consistent with mourning behaviors observed in wolves who've lost pack members. The regular visits, the protective circling, the extended periods of rest beside the grave, these all suggest a form of grief." "So what do we do?" asked the mayor, a practical woman concerned about both the wolf's welfare and potential tourism impact. "People are coming to see him. Is that harming him?" "I recommend minimal interference," Dr. Chen replied. "Create a designated viewing area, far enough away that visitors won't disturb him. No flash photography, no approaching the wolf, and absolutely no feeding except by authorized personnel." The town agreed to these terms, and a simple platform was constructed at the edge of the cemetery, providing a place for visitors to observe without intruding. Signs explained Shadow's story and requested respectful behavior. As spring slowly began to soften the mountain landscape, many expected Shadow to return to a more typical wolf lifestyle. Prey would be more abundant, and the instinct to hunt and roam should have drawn him away from his vigil. Yet while his visits became somewhat less regular, every second or third night rather than nightly, he continued to return to Kate's grave. What truly astonished the researchers was how Shadow began to time his visits to avoid peak human activity. He seemed to understand the patterns of cemetery visitors and would appear during quieter periods, often late at night or very early morning. It was as if he was adapting his mourning to accommodate the human world that had been so important to Kate. By late April, when wildflowers began to bloom across the mountainsides, an unexpected development occurred. Henry arrived one morning to find small yellow flowers carefully placed on Kate's grave. Assuming a visitor had left them, he thought nothing of it until he noticed something odd. The flowers were mountain buttercups, which grew only in a remote meadow several miles from town. Few hikers visited that area so early in the season. The next day more flowers appeared, and Henry decided to arrive early enough to perhaps catch whoever was leaving them. Hidden in the groundskeeper's shed before dawn, he witnessed something that left him speechless. Shadow arrived carrying a small bundle of purple lupine in his mouth. With careful movements, the wolf placed the flowers at the head of the grave, nudging them into position beside the previous day's offering. Henry waited until the wolf had retreated to the forest before approaching the grave. The flowers were arranged with what could only be described as purpose, not randomly dropped but placed in a small cluster. He took a photo with his phone, hands shaking slightly, and sent it to Tom with the message, "You need to see this." News of Shadow's flower offering spread through town like wildfire. Some dismissed it as coincidence. Perhaps the wolf had been carrying the flowers for some other reason and happened to drop them. Others saw it as further proof of the animal's extraordinary connection to Kate. Dr. Chen, who had returned to continue her observations, offered a measured perspective. Wolves have been known to collect and carry objects that interest them. It's possible that Shadow is connecting the scent or appearance of these flowers with Kate in some way, or it could be learned behavior. Perhaps he observed humans leaving flowers and is mimicking that action. Whatever the explanation, the flower deliveries continued throughout spring, creating a colorful display that changed every few days as Shadow brought different wildflowers and occasionally interesting branches or unusually shaped stones. Visitors to the cemetery increased, drawn by stories of the wolf's gifts. Local businesses began selling Shadow souvenirs, t-shirts with a wolf silhouette, coffee mugs bearing the phrase "faithful friend." The town council debated how to balance respect for what was happening with the economic opportunity it presented. Through it all, Shadow maintained his dignity and distance. He never approached humans, though he seemed less bothered by their presence as months passed. He would sometimes observe from the forest edge as people visited Kate's grave, his amber eyes watchful but no longer wary. By the time summer arrived in the mountains, Shadow had become more than just a local curiosity. He represented something profound about loyalty, grief, and the mysterious connections that can form between species. Children left drawings at the cemetery entrance, crayon pictures of a gray wolf surrounded by flowers. Letters arrived from around the country, many addressed simply to Shadow, Pine Ridge Cemetery. No one could have predicted what would happen next, as summer heat gave way to autumn chill, and the mountains prepared once again for winter's embrace. The bond between a wolf and his human friend would be tested in ways that would leave the entire community breathless with wonder. As autumn painted the mountains in fiery colors, Pine Ridge received news that changed the course of Shadow's story. A letter arrived at the town hall addressed to the mayor from a young man named Jack, Kate's nephew and only living relative. "I apologize for the delay in contacting you," the letter read. "I've been working abroad and only recently learned of my aunt's passing. I'll be arriving next week to settle her affairs and collect her belongings." The news spread quickly through town. Many wondered how Jack's arrival would affect Shadow and the unusual situation that had developed around Kate's grave. Would the young man understand? Would he care about the wolf that had formed such an extraordinary bond with his aunt? Tom, who had become something of an unofficial spokesperson for Shadow, took it upon himself to reach out. He called the number included in the letter and spent nearly an hour explaining the remarkable events of the past months. "I'm not sure he believed half of what I told him," Tom confided to Henry at the diner the next morning. "Can't blame him, really. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I wouldn't believe it either." Jack arrived on a crisp October afternoon, driving a rental car with city plates. He looked nothing like Kate, where she had been weathered and comfortable in practical outdoor gear. Her nephew was slim and pale, dressed in clothes better suited for an office than mountain country. He checked into the local inn, politely declining offers from townspeople who wanted to share stories about his aunt. "He seems nice enough," reported the innkeeper to curious neighbors. "Quiet. Said he needs to get his bearings before diving into everything." The next morning, Jack visited the ranger station, where he met with Tom and collected the keys to Kate's cabin. Their conversation was brief and businesslike. If Tom was disappointed by the young man's apparent lack of interest in Shadow, he kept it to himself. That afternoon, Jack made his first visit to the cemetery. Several locals happened to be there, though perhaps not entirely by coincidence, and watched from a distance as he stood silently by his aunt's grave. The flowers Shadow had left the previous night, late-blooming asters and red maple leaves, were still fresh on the stone. "Do wolves really leave flowers?" he asked Henry, who was tending a nearby plot. "This one does," Henry replied simply. "Been doing it for months now." Jack nodded, his expression unreadable, and left without further comment. For the next few days, Jack kept to himself, spending hours at Kate's cabin sorting through her belongings. Occasionally, he was seen hiking the nearby trails, a map in hand, seemingly familiarizing himself with the area his aunt had loved. To everyone's disappointment, he showed no interest in visiting the cemetery during evening hours when Shadow might appear. Then, nearly a week into his stay, Jack announced his intention to hike to Eagle Point, a challenging trail that led to Kate's favorite overlook. According to her will, she had asked for some of her ashes to be scattered there, a task the town had delayed until her nephew could be located. "I'll take care of it tomorrow," Jack told Tom. "It's something I need to do alone." Tom frowned, looking out the window at the gathering clouds. Weather might turn. That trail gets dangerous when wet. Maybe wait another day? "I've checked the forecast," Jack insisted. "I'll be fine. I want to do this before I leave." Early the next morning, Jack set out with a small container of his aunt's ashes and a day pack of supplies. The weather, despite Tom's concerns, seemed cooperative, cool but clear with just a few clouds on the distant horizon. Several hikers saw him on the lower portion of the trail, but by midday, he was climbing alone toward the more remote sections. What Jack didn't know, what even the most experienced local hikers sometimes misjudged, was how quickly mountain weather could change. By early afternoon, a bank of dark clouds had moved in from the west, bringing with it slashing rain that soon turned to sleet. The temperature dropped rapidly, and visibility on the upper trails reduced to mere feet. In the ranger station, Tom watched the weather radar with growing concern. "Eagle Point will be getting hammered right about now," he told his colleagues. "Anyone check in from that area?" No hikers had reported in from the upper section of trail. Tom tried calling Jack's cell phone, but as expected, there was no service in that remote area. After 30 minutes of deliberation, he made the call to send out a search team. "He's probably fine," Tom assured the others. "Probably turned back when the weather hit." But let's be sure. As the search team geared up, word reached town that Jack was missing on the mountain. The community, which had been somewhat cool toward the newcomer, immediately rallied. Volunteers arrived at the ranger station offering to help search, bringing extra gear and hot thermoses of coffee. But the worsening conditions made a full-scale search impossible until morning. A small professional team headed out to check the lower trails and the emergency shelter midway up the mountain. But the upper reaches, including Eagle Point, would have to wait. As darkness fell, concern deepened. If Jack had continued upward despite the weather, he could be in serious trouble. Hypothermia was a real risk, especially if he was unprepared for winter conditions. What happened next would become part of Pine Ridge legend. Henry, who had stayed late at the cemetery despite the weather, witnessed Shadow arrive for his usual visit. The wolf seemed agitated, pacing rather than settling by the grave. After just a few minutes, he lifted his head, sniffing the air, then suddenly took off toward the forest at a run. Struck by a sudden intuition, Henry called Tom. "The wolf just left, headed straight for the mountain trails. I've never seen him leave like that before." Tom was silent for a moment. "Then you think he's going after Jack?" "I think he knows something's wrong," Henry replied. "I can't explain it, but I'd bet my life on it." Throughout the night, the storm continued to batter the mountains. The search team had found no sign of Jack on the lower trails and had been forced to take shelter themselves as conditions worsened. In town, volunteers prepared for a full search at first light, gathering emergency medical supplies and organizing teams. Dawn broke with clearing skies but bitter cold. Frost coated every surface, and patches of ice made the trails treacherous. The expanded search team headed out at first light, expecting a long and possibly grim day ahead. Just after 9 a.m., as the teams were spreading out across the mountain, a call came in over the radio. A group checking the Eagle Point trail had spotted movement ahead. Not a person, but a large gray animal. "It's Shadow," the team leader reported, voice crackling with static. "He's coming down the trail, and he's not alone. Following behind the wolf, moving slowly but steadily, was Jack. He was limping heavily, using a broken branch as a makeshift crutch, his clothes torn and muddied. But he was alive, alert, and remarkably unharmed considering his ordeal. When the search team reached him, Jack collapsed into their arms, exhausted but conscious. Shadow stopped a short distance away, watching as the rescuers wrapped Jack in emergency blankets and assessed his condition. "The wolf found me," Jack kept saying, his voice hoarse. "I don't know how, but he found me." Back at the ranger station with medical attention and hot food, Jack told his story. He had indeed reached Eagle Point despite the worsening weather, determined to fulfill his aunt's wishes. After scattering her ashes, he had started back down, but in the poor visibility had strayed from the trail. A fall down a steep slope had left him with a sprained ankle and no clear sense of direction. I found a small overhang to shelter under, he explained. Tried to wait out the storm. It got so cold I must have fallen asleep. Thought I might not wake up. He paused, still seeming unable to believe what happened next. Then something was pushing at me, something warm. I opened my eyes and there was this huge wolf nudging me, almost like he was trying to wake me up. Jack had been terrified at first, certain he was about to be attacked, but Shadow made no aggressive moves. Instead, the wolf had paced back and forth between Jack and what turned out to be the actual trail, some 50 yards away. It was like he was showing me the way, Jack said. When I finally understood and started hobbling in that direction, he walked alongside me, staying close enough that I could almost touch him. Throughout the night, as Jack slowly made his way down the mountain, Shadow had remained with him. When Jack needed to rest, the wolf would wait. When he strayed from the trail in the darkness, Shadow would circle back, guiding him to the correct path. He led me all the way down, Jack finished, wonder still evident in his voice, right up until your search team spotted us. Then he backed off, but he didn't leave. It was like he was making sure I was in good hands before he'd go. The story of Shadow's rescue spread quickly, adding another remarkable chapter to the wolf's legend. Scientists and skeptics might suggest that Shadow had simply been hunting in the area, and Jack had misinterpreted his behavior. But those who knew Kate, who had witnessed Shadow's months of devotion at her grave, believed something far more meaningful had occurred. For Jack, the experience was transformative. The young man who had arrived in Pine Ridge seeming distant and uninterested now asked endless questions about his aunt and her relationship with the wolf. He extended his stay, postponing his return to the city indefinitely. I came here thinking I'd just pack up her things and sell the cabin, he admitted to Tom a week after his rescue. Now I'm not so sure. There's something special here, something I don't fully understand yet. As October gave way to November, Jack could often be seen sitting on the porch of Kate's cabin, reading through her journals and notes about the local wildlife. And sometimes at the edge of the clearing, a gray shadow would watch from the trees, neither approaching nor retreating, maintaining the careful balance between wild and tame that Kate had always respected. Winter settled over Pine Ridge once again, bringing with it the one-year anniversary of Kate's passing. But unlike the previous year, the small mountain town now held a different energy. What had begun as a story of loss had transformed into something unexpected, a tale of connection that crossed the boundaries between humans and wildlife. Jack, who had originally planned a brief visit to settle his aunt's affairs, had now been in Pine Ridge for nearly 3 months. The pale city dweller had changed, his skin tanned from outdoor work, his formerly soft hands now calloused from splitting firewood and repairing the cabin's roof. His temporary leave of absence from his job had stretched into a resignation letter, followed by remote consulting work that allowed him to remain in the mountains. Never thought I'd stay, he admitted to Tom over coffee at the local diner. Always thought Aunt Kate was a bit odd living out here alone. Now I get it. There's something about this place that gets under your skin. What Jack didn't say, what he scarcely admitted to himself, was how much Shadow had influenced his decision. After the wolf had guided him to safety on the mountain, Jack had developed an obsession with understanding the extraordinary animal. He had read through all of Kate's journals, poring over her detailed observations of Shadow from their first encounter to their final days together. One chilly December morning, Jack called an impromptu meeting at the town hall. Curious locals packed the small building, wondering what announcement the formerly reserved young man might have. I've been thinking about my aunt's legacy, Jack began, standing awkwardly before the crowd. She dedicated her life to protecting the wilderness and wildlife around Pine Ridge. I want to continue that work, but I need your help. His proposal was bold, to convert Kate's cabin and the surrounding 40 acres into a wildlife sanctuary and research center. The land would remain undeveloped, serving as a protected corridor for wildlife moving between larger wilderness areas. The cabin would become a small educational center, where visitors could learn about coexistence with wild animals. My aunt left me some money, Jack explained. Enough to get started. But for this to really work, it needs to be a community effort. To Jack's surprise and relief, the town embraced the idea enthusiastically. Local contractors offered discounted services to help renovate the cabin. The high school science teacher volunteered to develop educational programs. Even the mayor pledged support, recognizing the potential tourism benefits of an official wildlife sanctuary. "We'll call it Kate's Place," suggested Henry, the cemetery caretaker who had witnessed so much of Shadow's story. The name stuck immediately. Throughout the winter months, work progressed on the sanctuary. Jack lived in a small travel trailer while the cabin underwent renovations, transforming from a simple ranger's home into a space that could accommodate small groups of visitors. Local artists painted murals of mountain wildlife on the interior walls, prominently featuring a gray wolf that everyone recognized. Shadow remained a presence throughout this time, though his behavior continued to evolve. His nightly visits to Kate's grave became less frequent, once or twice a week rather than daily. But he began to appear more regularly at the edge of the sanctuary property, watching the construction with what seemed like curiosity. Dr. Chen, the wildlife biologist who had studied Shadow's cemetery vigil, returned to Pine Ridge to document this new development. She set up trail cameras around the sanctuary perimeter with Jack's permission. "He's establishing a new pattern," she explained, showing Jack footage of Shadow patrolling the property boundaries. "It's almost as if he's claiming this as territory, but not in a typical wolf way. He's not marking aggressively or trying to exclude other animals. He's just watching over it." By early spring, as the sanctuary neared completion, something remarkable began to happen. Shadow started bringing gifts to the cabin clearing, similar to the flowers and interesting items he had left at Kate's grave, but now deposited near the cabin porch. More surprisingly, he occasionally left more practical items, a freshly killed rabbit, once even a young deer. "He's providing for you," Dr. Chen said with amazement when Jack reported these offerings. "This goes beyond anything documented in wolf behavior toward humans outside of domestication. He's treating you as part of his pack." Jack, who had initially been terrified of the wolf during his mountain rescue, now found himself deeply moved by these gestures. He began leaving his own offerings in return: fresh water in a large stone bowl, occasionally meat purchased from the local butcher. "I'm not trying to tame him," he assured concerned wildlife officials, just acknowledging the connection. As spring bloomed across the mountains, Kate's Place Wildlife Sanctuary prepared for its official opening. A simple ceremony was planned, with a ribbon cutting and tours of the new facilities. Local media had been invited, along with representatives from state conservation agencies. The night before the opening, Jack sat alone on the cabin porch, anxiety keeping him awake despite the late hour. So much had changed in his life over the past months. He had abandoned his city career, invested most of his savings, and tied his future to this remote mountain community, all because of his aunt's legacy and a wolf that defied explanation. "Am I crazy?" he whispered to the star-filled sky. "What if this all falls apart?" A soft sound from the edge of the clearing drew his attention. Shadow stood there in the moonlight, his gray coat silvered, amber eyes reflecting the porch light. The wolf didn't approach, maintaining the respectful distance he always kept, but he didn't retreat either. Jack felt a curious calm settle over him. "Hello, friend," he said softly. "Big day tomorrow. Wish Aunt Kate could see it." The wolf tilted his head slightly as if listening. Then with deliberate movements he turned and trotted into the forest. Jack watched him go, oddly comforted by the brief encounter. The sanctuary's opening day dawned clear and beautiful. Visitors began arriving early. Locals first, then tourists who had heard the story of the grieving wolf, and finally officials from various wildlife agencies curious about the community initiative. Jack led tours of the small but well-designed facility, explaining the educational mission and conservation goals. Throughout the morning he kept glancing toward the forest edge, hoping that Shadow might make an appearance, but the wolf remained absent. "Don't worry," Tom assured him during a quiet moment. "He's smart enough to avoid crowds. He'll be back when things quiet down." The event was nearly over, with just a few visitors lingering, when a commotion erupted near the trail that led deeper into the sanctuary property. A frantic mother rushed toward Jack, panic in her eyes. "My daughter," she gasped. "She wandered off the trail. We can't find her." Within minutes, a search party formed. The missing girl was only 6 years old, wearing a bright yellow jacket last seen near the small stream that cut through the property. As volunteers spread out calling her name, Jack felt a sickening dread. Even a small wilderness area held dangers for a child alone. Steep slopes, cold water, the approaching evening chill. After an hour of searching with no success, Jack found himself alone on a remote section of trail, voice hoarse from calling. The sun was dipping toward the mountains, shadows lengthening across the forest floor. That's when he noticed Shadow standing motionless among the trees ahead. The wolf held his gaze for a long moment, then turned and walked slowly away, stopping to look back at Jack with unmistakable intention. "Are you showing me something?" Jack whispered, heart suddenly racing. He followed as Shadow led him off the main trail, down a game path he hadn't noticed before. The path wound through dense underbrush before opening into a small clearing. There, sitting on a fallen log, was the missing girl. Her jacket was muddy, her face tear-streaked, but she appeared unharmed. She was staring with wide eyes at Shadow, who had circled around to sit at the clearing's edge. "He found me," she said when she saw Jack. "I was scared and crying, and he came and sat with me. I thought he might eat me, but he just stayed there. I wasn't scared anymore." News of Shadow's second rescue spread far beyond Pine Ridge. National media picked up the story of the wolf who had gone from mourning his human friend to continuing her work of protecting both wilderness and people. Wildlife experts debated the meaning of his behavior, with some suggesting rare intelligence or even the influence of early contact with humans. For the people of Pine Ridge, no scientific explanation was necessary. They had witnessed something extraordinary unfolding in their community, a relationship between species that transcended typical boundaries. As summer settled over the mountains, Kate's place flourished. Visitors came from across the country, hoping to learn about wolves and perhaps catch a glimpse of the famous Shadow. Jack carefully managed these expectations, explaining that Shadow was still a wild animal who chose his own appearances. But those who stayed until evening, when the crowds had gone and quietness returned to the sanctuary, might be rewarded with the sight of a gray figure moving along the forest edge. Sometimes he would pause, amber eyes reflecting the last light of day, before continuing his patrol of the land that had once been Kate's and was now protected in her name. In the town cemetery, Kate's grave remained special. Though Shadow visited less frequently, he still occasionally left small offerings: a pine cone, colorful stones, seasonal wildflowers. Local children began their own tradition of adding small tokens beside the wolf's gifts, creating a constantly changing memorial that celebrated the connection between a dedicated ranger and the wolf she had saved. And on clear nights, when the mountain wind carried sounds for miles, residents of Pine Ridge would sometimes hear a lone howl echoing across the valley, not a cry of mourning anymore, but something that sounded remarkably like a song of protection, a promise to watch over the wilderness and those who cherished it, just as Kate would have wanted.